The tension in the hall was electric. Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani sat calmly on stage, hands folded, eyes focused forward, despite the storm of commentary swirling around him. Across from him sat Alan Dershowitz, America's most controversial constitutional law professor, his sharp gaze more piercing than usual as he adjusted the mic. "Mr. Mamdani," Dershowitz's voice sliced through the air like a blade, "I've been following your so-called activism in the New York State Assembly, and frankly, I think it's about time someone taught you some respect for legal tradition and constitutional authority." The packed auditorium fell silent. This wasn't your average panel discussion. It was a special live town hall, two polar opposites in worldview and generation, now facing off in a clash that would become the most talked about televised debate of the year. What happened next would catapult Mamdani into national political stardom and mark a rare moment where Alan Dershowitz, a man known for never losing a debate, was left searching for words. "Professor," Mamdani began, his tone calm but edged with unmistakable intent, "with all due respect, you might want to verify your facts before making assumptions about me." Gasps echoed across the auditorium. No one usually talks back to Alan Dershowitz, certainly not like that. But Mamdani was about to do exactly that, and his response would leave the legendary legal figure speechless for the first time in recent memory. If you're ready to see how a democratic socialist assemblyman from Queens took on one of the most well-known constitutional scholars in America, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because what happened on that stage wasn't just a debate, it was a generational reckoning. To understand why this confrontation hit so hard, you have to know who these two men are and what brought them to that stage. Alan Dershowitz has been a towering figure in American legal debate for over 5 decades. Now in his 80s, he's built a reputation and a fortune as an aggressive defender of constitutional orthodoxy. He rose from Brooklyn public schools to Harvard Law School, where he taught for decades, and became the go-to legal expert for everyone from CNN to Fox News. Dershowitz is known for being the sharpest mind in the room, and for making sure everyone else knows it too. He has argued high-profile cases, advised presidents, and never hesitated to challenge critics with the full weight of legal precedent. He prides himself on logic, discipline, and a deep belief in the foundational strength of America's institutions. But that's exactly why Zohran Mamdani frustrates him so much. At just 32, Mamdani represents a radically different vision for public service. The son of immigrants, a Muslim democratic socialist, and former housing counselor, he's unapologetically confrontational about inequality, colonialism, and systems of power. He didn't get into politics through elite institutions. He got there by knocking on doors, organizing rent strikes, and challenging the assumptions of the status quo. Where Dershowitz demands respect for institutions, Mamdani demands accountability from them. Where Dershowitz believes in the endurance of the Constitution, Mamdani believes in its reinterpretation to serve the people it often leaves behind. Their clash wasn't just ideological, it was generational, philosophical, foundational. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about a televised debate, it was about two fundamentally different philosophies of power, tradition, and respect colliding in real time. Alan Dershowitz embodied the old guard: defer to authority first, ask questions later. His worldview was built on reverence for the Constitution, institutional longevity, and the belief that experience inherently conferred legitimacy. Zohran Mamdani represented something radically different: a new generation of public servants who believed authority must earn respect through action, not inherit it through status or seniority. He saw institutions not as sacred relics, but as tools that must be constantly questioned, examined, and when necessary, rebuilt. The winner of this exchange would send a clear message about what kind of leadership America was ready to embrace. Would Dershowitz's legacy and traditional authority win the day? Or would Mamdani's principled clarity and deep preparation signal that a new, unflinching generation had arrived? The audience, a mix of students, legal scholars, and policy junkies, knew they were about to witness something historic, and it didn't take long. The confrontation began almost immediately. The forum, promoted as a discussion on justice, power, and public trust, took a sharp turn as Dershowitz leaned toward the mic, papers in hand, his tone condescendingly formal. "Assemblyman Mamdani," he began, thumbing through his notes with exaggerated drama. "I've reviewed your record in Albany, and I must say I'm not impressed." The room tensed. The air thickened with anticipation. "You seem to believe that being provocative, loud, and ideologically rigid somehow makes you effective. What I see," Dershowitz said, turning slightly toward the crowd, "is a young man who still hasn't learned to respect his elders or the institutions they helped build." Mamdani didn't flinch, but those familiar with him noticed the slightest narrowing of his eyes. Dershowitz had just made his first strategic mistake. He had reduced Mamdani's political clarity to noise and questioned his seriousness. "Professor," Mamdani replied evenly, his voice calm but unwavering, "I'd be happy to discuss my legislative record and the principles that inform my policy work. You might be surprised by what I've actually accomplished." But Dershowitz wasn't looking for a discussion. He was looking to dominate. "Don't professor me in that tone," Dershowitz snapped, his voice rising. "I've been interpreting constitutional law since before you were born. I've seen countless young idealists like you who think they've got it all figured out, and you know what they usually are?" He paused, smirking. "Wrong." The crowd stirred. The dynamic was clear. Dershowitz was trying to assert dominance through age, prestige, and rhetorical authority. "You want to talk accomplishments?" he continued. "I've argued before the Supreme Court, advised presidents, and taught at Harvard for 50 years. I've earned more credibility in a year than most elected officials do in a lifetime." Mamdani leaned in slightly, voice still composed, but now with a razor-sharp edge. "Professor Dershowitz," he said, "I'm not entirely sure what you mean by people like me. Could you clarify that?" The words hung in the air like a live wire. Everyone in the room felt it. Dershowitz had walked into dangerous territory, and Mamdani had just dared him to say it out loud. Perhaps sensing the trap, Dershowitz pivoted. "What I mean," he huffed, "is this new breed of politicians who believe they can upend decades of precedent overnight. You've barely been in office a few years, and yet you seem to think you have the right to lecture federal judges, challenge our legal institutions, and propose radical overhauls." And that was the opening Mamdani had been waiting for. Dershowitz had just exposed that he fundamentally misunderstood Mamdani's actual constitutional role and the purpose of legislative oversight. "Professor," Mamdani said, his voice now carrying the grounded confidence of someone who knew he had the law on his side, "I think there may be some confusion about how our constitutional system works." The energy in the room shifted. Mamdani wasn't reacting anymore, he was positioning, and Dershowitz, whether he realized it or not, had just given him the stage. The audience could feel it. The energy in the room was shifting. Mamdani wasn't backing down. He wasn't just holding his ground. He was preparing to strike, calmly, methodically, and with facts. Dershowitz, still believing he had the upper hand, leaned forward, his voice sharp with impatience. "Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young man," he snapped. "I've been interpreting law longer than you've been alive. The problem with your generation is that you think you know everything, but you've got no respect for the institutions that hold this country together." He pointed directly at Mamdani, his tone rising with the theatrical rhythm that had made him a regular guest on every major news network. "You want my honest opinion?" he said. "You're a political showman, a grandstander. You use provocative language to stir up noise. But real public servants, real lawyers, do their work quietly, carefully, and with professionalism." But what Dershowitz didn't realize was that he had just walked straight into a carefully set trap, one that Mamdani had likely prepared for weeks in advance. By questioning Mamdani's professionalism and legal grasp, Dershowitz had opened the door for his opponent to demonstrate just how thoroughly equipped he really was. Mamdani sat back slightly, a subtle smile forming at the corners of his mouth, an expression well known to those who had watched him dismantle housing officials and corporate lobbyists in Albany committee hearings. "Professor," he said, coolly reaching into a stack of papers on the podium, "since you've chosen to question my legal understanding and professional credentials, I think now is a good time to review some facts." Dershowitz raised an eyebrow, still smug, still confident. "Facts?" he scoffed. What facts could you possibly offer that would hold weight in this room? Mamdani opened the folder deliberately, turning one page with calm precision. Well, he said, his voice steady, let's begin with something you said just a moment ago about respecting institutions and handling matters quietly. You've said you've been interpreting the Constitution for decades, and that's true. But I believe the audience might find it relevant how some of your most public legal positions have been handled, especially when it comes to actual legal standards and ethical interpretation. The room quieted completely. Everyone, students, panelists, the moderator, sensed that Mamdani was building towards something serious. Dershowitz's confident facade flickered for a moment. Mamdani pulled out a set of printouts and held them up. Professor, he continued, I took the liberty of reviewing some of your more high-profile legal defenses in public writings, particularly your arguments surrounding due process and presidential immunity. You've claimed consistency in defending constitutional norms, but there are notable contradictions. Dershowitz blinked, suddenly more alert. For example, Mamdani continued, now stepping closer to the audience, in your 1997 essay for The New Republic, you criticized the idea that presidents should be shielded from investigation. Yet, in 20, you reversed that position while defending a sitting president. The shift was so sharp that even constitutional scholars you once mentored publicly questioned your reasoning. What are you doing? Dershowitz demanded, but there was hesitation in his voice now. I'm illustrating the difference, Mamdani said smoothly, between legal performance and principled consistency. Since you've questioned my qualifications, I thought it might be useful to examine yours, publicly, transparently, and factually. The audience was captivated. This wasn't just a generational debate anymore. It had become a real-time case study in legal accountability. Mamdani held up another document. This is a transcript from a 1987 debate at Harvard where you argued that criminal law must never be subject to political convenience. But that principle, by your own words, was abandoned in your later defense strategies. Why the shift, Professor? Dershowitz's face had begun to flush slightly. That debate, he said defensively, was based on the facts and context of its time. Perhaps, Mamdani responded, but here's what's interesting. In a 2019 Federal Law Review article, multiple legal scholars cited your evolving arguments as examples of selective constitutionalism, prioritizing personal alliances over principled jurisprudence. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in. Even seasoned legal journalists in the front row looked stunned. The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Alan Dershowitz, the man known for demolishing his opponents with legal references and intellectual dominance, was being fact-checked in real time, and he clearly hadn't expected it. What happened next marked a turning point in the entire confrontation. Visibly rattled, Dershowitz made a critical error. How dare you come onto this stage and question my legal record? He snapped, rising slightly from his seat, face flushed with indignation. I don't care what some law review article said 20 years later. I know how to interpret this Constitution. I've done it longer than you've been around. But Mamdani wasn't finished, not even close. Professor, he said calmly, rising to stand, his full stature and training as a public servant now fully on display. That actually brings up an important point. He looked directly at Dershowitz. This isn't your courtroom. This isn't your classroom. It's not 1985 at Harvard Law School. This is a public debate, and you're not an active jurist anymore. You're a media commentator, a legal personality. The silence in the hall was deafening. I respect your legacy, Mamdani continued, but the authority you're invoking over me as an elected official, it's symbolic, not constitutional. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone had finally said aloud what many had long whispered. Dershowitz's status was no longer anchored in legal office, but media presence. And he was facing someone who had nothing to lose and everything to defend, with facts. I'm an elected state legislator, Mamdani went on. My accountability is to the people, not to legal punditry or institutional nostalgia. Our roles in the legal political ecosystem are very different. And frankly, Professor, I believe that's the real issue at play here. Dershowitz was speechless. For the first time in recent memory, Someone had systematically dismantled his authority, calmly, professionally, without a hint of disrespect, and with surgical precision. The stage was now fully Mamdani's, and what came next would become a defining moment. Replayed millions of times and analyzed in lecture halls as a masterclass in principled confrontation. Still standing, Mamdani's voice remained composed, but carried the weight of someone who had spent years studying democratic systems. Not to protect power, but to hold it accountable. "Since we're discussing respect for institutions," he said, pulling out another neatly labeled folder, "allow me to explain how ours actually works." He flipped it open with deliberate care. "As a member of a legislative body, I took an oath to uphold and defend our Constitution. That responsibility isn't symbolic. It includes oversight of both the executive and judicial branches, especially when it comes to ethics, transparency, and public trust." Dershowitz attempted to interject, but Mamdani held steady, his tone cool, his cadence deliberate, his logic unassailable. "You've called this grandstanding, but the Constitution doesn't see it that way. Article 1, Section 1 vests legislative power in Congress and state legislatures. Article 1, Section 8 gives us the power to regulate and investigate courts. This isn't performance, this is process. It's called checks and balances, and it's fundamental to how democracy functions." He pulled out a copy of the Constitution itself and held it high, as if reminding the audience that the real authority in the room was the text, not the resume. "When I raise concerns about judicial ethics, whether at the federal or state level, I'm not being disrespectful. I'm doing what the framers expected of us. They didn't write the Constitution so it could sit behind glass. They wrote it so we could use it." The crowd was riveted. This wasn't just a generational clash anymore. It was a civic intervention, delivered by someone who clearly understood the weight of public responsibility. "Professor," Mamdani added, "you said I don't respect institutions, but respectfully, I think you may not understand what my institutional role actually requires." And he still wasn't done. Mamdani reached into the folder and pulled out one final document, one that would prove to be the decisive blow. "You mentioned that real lawyers handle their business quietly and professionally," he said, looking up from the page. "That's an interesting perspective, but it's not supported by either constitutional precedent or democratic necessity." "That's an interesting perspective, Professor," Mamdani said, not missing a beat. "But it's not one supported by legal precedent." He lifted a well-worn legal brief from his folder. "In McGrain versus Dougherty, 1927, the Supreme Court held that Congress, and by extension, legislative bodies, not only have the right, but the duty to investigate and expose government wrongdoing. The court stated clearly that legislative oversight is essential to informed lawmaking." Dershowitz stared at Mamdani, his expression a strange mix of shock and reluctant admiration. This wasn't what he had expected, not from a younger democratic socialist state legislator from Queens. He had anticipated posturing. He was getting a constitutional law seminar. Mamdani continued, unwavering. "So when I question judicial conflicts of interest, undisclosed gifts, or ethical lapses," he said, locking eyes with Dershowitz, "I'm not grandstanding. I'm doing precisely what the Supreme Court says is necessary for democracy to function." Then, with a pivot as seamless as it was devastating, Mamdani shifted from legal doctrine to personal credentials. His tone sharpened, still respectful, but now undeniably pointed. "Professor, you questioned my qualifications earlier," he said. "Allow me to clarify for you and for the audience." He held up a single sheet of paper, his resume. "I graduated from Bowdoin College. I was a housing counselor and organizer before entering public service. I didn't inherit political clout or gain influence through elite institutions. I earned it. I was elected by the people of Queens to fight for tenants, immigrants, and workers. And now I serve in the New York State Assembly, where I help write and shape the laws of one of the most populous states in the country." The contrast with Dershowitz's high-profile legal media career was becoming clearer with every word. "My qualifications to speak about law, power, and responsibility aren't built on television appearances or best-selling books. They're built on real-world experience, real legal frameworks, in the trust of the people I represent. And then came the line that would echo across social media and law classrooms for weeks. You said I don't understand respect for institutions, Professor, Mamdani said. But what I think you really meant is that you expect deference to authority figures, regardless of whether that authority is earned or appropriate. His voice remained steady but firm. I have deep respect for legitimate institutional authority. I respect judges who follow ethical codes. I respect scholars who challenge systems with intellectual honesty. I even respect media personalities when they stay in their lane. The implication was razor sharp, and the audience understood it instantly. But, Mamdani added, respect for institutions does not mean blind obedience to those who merely claim authority without accountability. He paused, then delivered what would become the most quoted moment of the night. You criticize my generation for thinking we know everything, he said. But the truth is we don't believe we know everything. We believe we know enough to ask the right questions of the right people at the right time. He gestured gently to the audience and the stage around them. You built your career holding people accountable. You demanded answers, challenged inconsistencies, and exposed contradictions. So tell me, Professor, how is what I'm doing any different? It was devastating. For decades, Dershowitz had grilled presidents, debated legal giants, and exposed misconduct. But when the same scrutiny was applied to the institutions he revered, it suddenly became disrespect. Mamdani continued, calmly returning to his seat. When I ask hard questions, he said, I'm holding lifetime appointed judges and public officials accountable for decisions that affect millions of lives. He paused. When you ask hard questions, it's usually about someone's latest book deal or a headline-making court case. That's fine, but let's not pretend it's the same. Then, as if saving his final blow for last, Mamdani leaned forward and delivered the line that brought the entire crowd to a breathless silence. You said earlier that you've earned more money than most politicians could dream of. That may be true, but money is not how we measure success in public service. Mamdani leaned slightly forward, his voice quiet, but filled with unmistakable conviction. I could have gone into corporate law. I could have made more money in private practice, climbing the ladder at a white shoe firm. But I didn't, he said. I chose public service because there were things more important than money. The hall fell completely silent. Even Alan Dershowitz seemed to sense that something deeper was happening now, something bigger than just a debate. So when you question my qualifications or my methods, Professor, Mamdani said, turning fully to him, I want you to understand something. I'm not here for money or recognition or airtime. I'm here because our democratic framework requires oversight, and I take that responsibility seriously. For perhaps the first time in his long public career, Dershowitz was genuinely speechless. He sank slightly back into his seat, no longer defensive, just stunned. His expression softened into something halfway between surprise and reluctant respect. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its previous edge. Assemblyman, that was quite a response. The words were quiet, but everyone in the room heard them. Alan Dershowitz, the man famous for always having the final word, had just been out-argued by someone less than half his age. He hesitated, then added slowly, I think I may have underestimated you. Mamdani smiled slightly, not out of arrogance, but with the knowing weariness of someone who had heard that line many times before. Professor, he replied gently, that's been happening my entire career. I'm used to it. And with that, the room erupted. The audience, many of whom had come expecting Mamdani to be dismantled by the legendary legal icon, had instead witnessed something unprecedented. They had watched a young democratic socialist with constitutional knowledge and moral clarity dismantle a titan of American legal commentary, not with disrespect, but with precision, preparation, and principle. People were on their feet, applauding. Others were already recording on their phones. Some were visibly emotional. They knew they had witnessed something historic. This wasn't just good television. It was a masterclass in how to challenge power without abandoning professionalism. Even Dershowitz's own assistants looked stunned. They had worked with him for years, and no one had ever handled him quite like that. The immediate aftermath of Mamdani's methodical dismantling of Dershowitz's authority was unlike anything the academic or media world had seen in years. As the panel concluded, the atmosphere backstage was electric. Producers, legal experts, and commentators all knew the same thing. They hadn't just filmed a discussion. They had captured a turning point. Dershowitz, visibly shaken but now humbled, approached Mamdani as they were preparing to leave the stage. "Assemblyman Mamdani," he said sincerely during the closing remarks, "I owe you an apology. I came into this thinking I knew who you were and what you stood for. I was wrong." The apology was unprecedented. Alan Dershowitz, the man who prided himself on never yielding, had yielded because Mamdani's response had been too detailed, too thoughtful, and too anchored in principle to ignore. Behind the scenes, the event's media producers were already debating how to handle what they had just recorded. They had struck television gold, yes, but it was also clear that their featured veteran had just been upstaged by a calm, unshakable newcomer. Within minutes of the panel wrapping, clips from the confrontation were already flooding social media. The full segment wouldn't air for weeks, but audience members had already uploaded footage. #Zohran Schools Dershowitz started trending within the hour. It was soon followed by hashtags like #constitutional clapback, #Nugar rising, and respect earned. This is required viewing for anyone who wants to understand how oversight actually works. That was the verdict from one of the top legal analysts on X, formerly Twitter, and it summed up the response from across the legal, academic, and political worlds. Legal Twitter lit up. Constitutional law professors, clerks, legal aid attorneys, many of whom had spent years watching politicians flail through constitutional questions, were now celebrating someone who actually knew what he was talking about. One viral tweet read, "Dershowitz, you don't respect institutions. Zohran Mamdani pulls out Constitution. Let me explain how institutions are actually supposed to work." The memes started almost instantly. One showed Mamdani calmly holding up a stack of documents with the caption, "When someone tries to lecture you about law, but you've actually read the Constitution." Another zoomed in on Dershowitz's stunned face with the caption, "When the student becomes a teacher." Legal organizations quickly took notice. The American Bar Association's official account shared a clip of Mamdani's constitutional explanation with the comment, "This is why legal education matters." Within days, law schools began reaching out to Mamdani's office, requesting permission to use the footage in their constitutional law and civics courses. Harvard Law School's own professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "I'm showing this in class next week. It's the clearest, calmest explanation of legislative oversight I've heard in a decade." Even federal judges, speaking off the record, expressed admiration. One told the Washington Post, "He articulated the constitutional principles better than most attorneys who appear before me." But the impact went far beyond the legal world. The political fallout was immediate. Within hours, Democratic leadership realized they had something rare, a young, prepared, fearless voice who could explain complex constitutional issues in plain, persuasive language. By the weekend, Mamdani had been invited to appear on multiple national Sunday shows, not as a radical activist, but as a respected constitutional thinker. The Speaker of the New York State Assembly issued a statement. Assemblyman Mamdani demonstrated the kind of clarity, professionalism, and constitutional knowledge that public service desperately needs. His defense of oversight and public integrity was exemplary. Even some Republicans, while disagreeing with his politics, publicly acknowledged his skill. One GOP committee member told reporters, "I don't agree with his worldview, but the guy clearly knows his constitutional law." That was impressive. But the moment meant more than just political gain. For decades, Alan Dershowitz had been seen as the embodiment of legal authority, the elder statesman who could shut down any challenge through sheer experience and rhetorical force. Mamdani's response offered a new model, not combative, not disrespectful, just better prepared, smarter, sharper, relentlessly informed. Cultural commentators picked up immediately on the generational and ideological shift. For years, the public has been told to trust the old guard simply because they've been around longer, wrote one columnist. But Zohran Mamdani just showed what it looks like when the next generation shows up prepared and unafraid. He hadn't just defended himself, he had defended the principles that made democratic accountability possible in the first place. In the weeks following the confrontation, both men saw their public profiles shift dramatically. For Zohran Mamdani, he went from being known primarily as a fiery, progressive assemblyman from Queens to being recognized as a serious constitutional thinker and national political voice. Speaking invitations poured in from universities, bar associations, think tanks, and international human rights organizations. His book deal, already in quiet negotiation, suddenly became a bidding war. Publishers saw in Mamdani something rare, a leader who could explain complex legal and political ideas in plain, principled language, and do it under pressure. Most importantly, his colleagues in Albany began to treat him with a new level of respect. Committee chairs sought his advice on constitutional implications. Leadership teams included him in high-level strategy briefings. He was no longer just an outsider voice, he was now an insider resource. As for Alan Dershowitz, the impact was more complicated. While some pundits criticized him for being outclassed, many commended his gracious acknowledgement of Mamdani's preparation and clarity. In some circles, the confrontation actually enhanced his reputation, not because he won the argument, but because he showed he was secure enough to admit when he was wrong. However, the debate also exposed the limits of his media persona. Several legal commentators noted that while Dershowitz's style of courtroom confidence worked well in televised soundbites or elite academic panels, it proved less effective when faced with someone grounded in constitutional oversight and community-based legal understanding. The confrontation taught a number of powerful lessons that rippled through American political and legal discourse. Preparation beats intimidation. Mamdani's success didn't come from volume or theatrics. It came from research, clarity, and constitutional grounding. Respect goes both ways. He proved that you could challenge authority without raising your voice and still land every point with devastating precision. Constitutional knowledge still matters. In an age of sound bites and slogans, Mamdani's detailed explanations reminded the public just how few elected officials truly understand the legal frameworks they swear to uphold. The debate also offered a vision of a new leadership model, informed, unintimidated, unapologetically ethical, a model where moral clarity and institutional literacy replace posturing in political theater. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the moment was educational. Clips from the exchange quickly became required material in law schools, political science departments, and leadership development programs. High school civics teachers used Mamdani's words to explain checks and balances. Law professors showed his performance as a textbook example of effective argument under pressure. Political scientists dissected the event as a case study in generational transitions and institutional accountability. It also sparked a wider national conversation about civic literacy, with commentators across the spectrum noting how clearly Mamdani laid out constitutional oversight and how poorly most Americans understood it. His approach inspired a new wave of young politicians who began focusing more on substantive knowledge and policy mastery rather than social media virality or combative soundbites. It even changed how veteran figures approach younger leaders. The message was clear: underestimate them at your own risk. Political consultants began studying Mamdani's approach as a model, how to be both respectful and unyielding, professional and impactful. The confrontation also shifted media focus, with political outlets starting to highlight expertise and substance rather than scandal or clickbait. Mamdani's performance proved something vital, that the audience was hungry for real content, and that truth delivered clearly and confidently could be just as captivating as controversy. In the end, the confrontation between Zohran Mamdani and Alan Dershowitz established a new standard for public discourse. It proved that respect for authority and accountability of authority are not mutually exclusive. Mamdani didn't win by being loud. He won by being right and being ready. He turned what was supposed to be a humiliating defeat into a teachable moment for the entire country. The episode proved that in America, no matter your age, background, or fame, constitutional knowledge still counts, preparation still matters, And truth still has power, especially when it's spoken by someone brave enough to stand up for it. What did you think of Zohran Mamdani's handling of Alan Dershowitz? Did he strike the right balance between respect and accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more moments when preparation meets power. Because the next showdown is always just around the corner, and you won't want to miss it.